Today, as we walk through with this esteemed panel, will help us set the stage for what the conversation will take going forward. So to that end, if we could just ask each of you to maybe spend a few minutes, talk a bit about maybe what you're doing, and maybe some reflections you would have. We've got about 45, 50 minutes together, so we want to be mindful of our time, but we want to also have the richness of the conversation with you. So if you can, maybe we'll start with Arlene and just give a couple minutes of what really interests you from what you've heard, or maybe some of the things that you're working on. We'd appreciate that perspective to set us up.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Well, I, as Chad said, lead the sustainability group at Suncor, so I've spent a lot of time in the last few years working on climate policy and climate strategy and really in that collaboration space. So I have to say, as I listened to the speakers this morning, or this afternoon, sorry, I've got the daytime mixed up here. I was really struck by the theme of that collaboration leadership. I think Daniel Clark was really outlining the characteristics of shared value and from authentic relationships to collaborative leadership. And as I think about collaborative leadership, I think about some of my favorite definitions around that. You know, when we're collaborating, it's really working together to achieve shared purpose. It's different than cooperating. And in leadership, I think about my favorite, definition there is enabling others to achieve purpose in conditions of uncertainty. And then, so when you think about that collaborative leadership, it's really working together to enable others. It's really other-focused, and it's different than being in a negotiation, which is much more interest-based. It requires that, ability to roll up your sleeves and problem solve. And so I thought I would just share a couple of the lessons that I've learned over the last few years in the collaborative leadership space. And one is that it's really hard work. Even within our own industry and our own sector, I know hard to believe, but we don't all think the same. And so, being in that space of asking questions, not being interest-based either for your own company or just the sector, but really unpeeling the layers back to figure out how we can work together on that common ground. It's really hard work. The other lesson that I've learned through that is just this notion that, we all have good ideas. I mean, you from the Energy Futures Lab know that better than anybody else. When you bring those ideas together, you can't be arrogant. You have to really appreciate the ideas of others. And the building of trust is really important. Like it requires that trusting, authentic relationships to really be able to work together to move forward. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to say is it sometimes just requires that you actually seize the moment. Sometimes a window opens with an opportunity to move forward on a really complex problem, and you just have to step into that space through the door and seize that moment. And I think that happened over the last couple of years with Alberta's climate leadership. With the election of the NDP government, with low oil prices, with Paris in 2015, the election of the Liberal government, all of these things created a moment where stepping into a climate leadership space and redefining what we could do in Alberta was possible. So anyway, I thought some of those themes came out in some of the sessions that speakers that we heard from this afternoon.
So my background is, I'm from Edmonton, grew up sort of around the oil and gas industry here, as most Albertans have, and going into university, I studied chemical engineering as well as business, and so again, that's a trajectory that'll often lead to that industry. I had a lot of really cool opportunities along the way to work in the oil and gas industry as well as outside of it, and seeing sort of the innovations that are happening within and outside of that industry has been really exciting. So for me, as sort of a young person and trying to figure out what my career path is going to be and where I'm going to be, I had the opportunity. I got to work in startup companies where we were looking at how do we recycle plastics and use them in different ways, and how do we take materials that have come out of this industry and do them differently. I've also worked in finance in more traditional roles, and then in renewable energy deployments with biogas and now energy storage is what I'm doing. And I think as sort of somebody who's looking at the industry as a starting point, I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of growth and excitement around how do we change and how do we adapt and how do we look forward into what the future will be, and bring some leadership to that, and say we do want to adapt, and we do need different solutions in a world that's transitioning, and it's all about Alberta's transition right now, and what is that going to look like, and how do we bring the right people into those conversations and have all of the people at the table to make sure that this is moving forward effectively. So I think one of the things that really stood out from the presentations today for me was the emphasis on community. And all of this ties back to, I think, building community and building resilient lifestyles and ways of living across our country and around the world. And in Alberta especially, how do we bring, I think there's very exciting opportunities and very exciting examples also of communities who are being able to own their own projects or own their own energy, and think about how you bring in the private sector partners and the community partners to make decisions collaboratively together, and build those real partnerships to have a resilient society overall.
Tansei Huakia, Nia Malina Mio up in Lubukan Masmo. I'm Lubukon Cree from Northern Alberta. I've been working on climate and energy issues for over the past decade, and so from Albertan, homegrown. So I'm really happy to see these types of dialogues happening, especially here in like the financial capital of what is seen as the resource, financing resource extraction. I guess for me today, what I've really taken away is basically the need to continue to have this type of dialogue. I feel like, we've really seen a polarization in Alberta. I know myself, I've been a part of that polarization because I think everyone probably in this room has, because I think we're very strong in what our opinions are. But I think, the reason why I'm a part of the Energy Futures Lab and why I believe in it so much is because I feel like it does bring together a diverse group of people that really need to have these really tough discussions and really come to a deeper understanding of where we're coming from. Because I was born in a small Indigenous community in Northern Alberta, and so we've seen the impacts. I think a lot of people in Calgary here that maybe even are born and raised haven't necessarily come up to our communities and really seen kind of the detrimental impacts that we are experiencing from fossil fuel extraction. And I think that's really important for all of us to understand those impacts on a deeper level. And I think, what I heard from Desmond especially too, of like, what does it mean being a treaty person? Because everyone in this room is a treaty person. It's not just Indigenous peoples that have benefited from treaty, and I would actually argue the reverse. We haven't benefited from the treaties. I think non-Indigenous peoples have actually benefited more. So I think deepening our understanding as Albertans, as Canadians, what actually reconciliation means. What does that actually mean moving forward, especially in this 150 years celebratory mode that we're in? And I think what also I'm really excited about too, and what excites me a lot is this transition, is this opportunity that we're facing right now in Alberta. And I think it's scary for a lot of people, but I think it's also really exciting for a lot of people. Myself, I've put up a 20.8 kilowatt system in my home community, which powers our health center. And we're completely surrounded by oil and gas, but I really wanted to see in my community the changes and really allow the young people to see the changes that can happen. And what does it mean being a master electrician for a solar company, as opposed to, finding inspiring new jobs. And I think that's why I really appreciate Liam and Iron and Earth, because we are seeing what does a just transition mean for workers, but also for communities that have really faced the brunt of resource extraction and, breathe in that air, experience those oil spills, like my home community, which had one of the biggest oil spills in Alberta's history right beside our homes. And, what does that feel like when communities have to breathe in those fumes and feel really sick from it? So I think, these are both experiences of Albertans, and how do we kind of come together to really, for me, what it's looking like right now, especially with this NDP government, is pushing for really progressive energy policy that really benefits and serves all of our communities, and allows for communities to really own their energy as well, as we diversify this energy matrix that we live in. So hi, thank you so much.
I've always had an interest in environmental issues, and actually starting here when I played in Calgary, developed a relationship with Suzuki Foundation with David as well, and my first kind of kick in the butt to get outside of my house and do something that of action was him explaining to me that as a hockey player I had a great platform to stand for something good. And for me, that what was important was to care for our city and take pride in where we lived, and whether that's big scope Canada or smaller scale in the city where we lived, things like recycling, things like composting, all those issues meant something to me. So from that moment of kind of being pushed to do something more publicly, to growing it into what we have now at NHL Green, where the whole league is carbon neutral, into something bigger like the board I sit on at Green Sports Alliance, where we have 500 members of venues and arenas and leagues that are looking to incorporate sustainability from a business standpoint. Those are things that I'm very passionate about, is how can we scale caring and sustainability, but always with a business lens. So from that, last couple of years of my hockey career, I took school through Harvard Extension in corporate sustainability and innovation. So now transitioning out of hockey and diving headfirst into this is my crowd. I'm having a lot of fun here. So listening to today's talks were fantastic. I've spent a lot of time down in the States over the past couple of years. I've partnered with venture capital down there and have gotten into that world, which has led me into a lot of incubators and startups in places like San Francisco and Boston, where I have more ties, but sadly not enough here in Alberta. So it is very rewarding to hear good ideas coming out of our own home province, and the push for leadership here, not just for trying to keep our head above water while we go through tough times, but really asking those tough questions of how do we innovate, how do we diversify here and meaningfully. And so for me, what I want to see out of Albertans is to resist that urge, to be divided in how we think, and to put ourselves in silos of how we believe. And I think that we have a lot of leaders here, whether it's the mayors of our two biggest cities, where Don and Naheed Nenshi, I think they're a fantastic leadership. I think that it takes community leaders to be able to see both perspectives, the environmental perspective and the business perspective. And I think that for me, the leadership has to set the tone at the top. I mean, one of my most proud moments as an Albertan was seeing some of the oil sand companies come forth in support of the carbon tax. To me, that's the best stamp of approval, is when you can have big business look at a good idea and say, that is a good idea for all of us. That's a good idea for business. That's a good idea for environment. And I think that, to me, that's what leadership has to be going forward in Alberta, is the ability to look across at the other people who are also Albertans, and realize that we have a lot more in common than we do differences, and that at the end of the day we want the same thing. We want economic prosperity within our province, and we want to take care of our province because we're proud of it, and we're proud of being viewed as good stewards of where we're living. So I think the ability to look across the aisle and say, that's a good idea. And I think it was mentioned, I forgot who said it, but the ability to be able to change your own thoughts and change your own mind as well, and listen to others, and not be so firmly planted in your beliefs, so that when you hear better ideas, you can also adapt your own thoughts as well. So I could echo the same sentiments. The collaboration, the partnership. You see that going forward. I think just peeking into the venture capital world, you see that good ideas die very quickly if they're not well supported by a number of people, and that does take a very solid infrastructure within cities or provinces or states in the state to happen. Good ideas don't just become reality because it's a good idea. It really does take multiple levels of support, whether it's through business or government and the community as well. So it's promising to see Alberta really taking, I think, big steps over the last couple of years, whether we were forced there through our situation or not. As long as the end goal is the same, it doesn't matter.
It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be here today, and it's totally inspiring. Usually when I'm in Calgary, because I'm based in Toronto and sometimes in Beijing, I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's true, I usually manage to arrange for a police escort to the airport. I once spoke at the Petroleum Club and told them they'd be out of business in 10 years. I spoke at the Energy Ministers Conference in Kananaskis and got a free ride back to the airport. I'm a little bit of an agent provocateur, and I'm going to hopefully play that role. I did coin this term clean tech 15 years ago on a canoe trip in Algonquin Park in Ontario. We bought the domain name cleantech.com from a dry cleaner in Iowa. The first time we went to Silicon Valley to talk to people about it, we tried to get a meeting on what is known as Sandhill Road, and we were told if we could wait till 2 o'clock, the janitor would be back. So, this kind of jovial but historical record is important because we have come a long, long, long way. What I think is a few opening comments on this. The whole world is having these conversations, but they don't have it in the way that Alberta's having it. They're not having the conversation in an inclusive way. They're not having it from having inherited a natural resource bounty. But the Danes, the Cincinnati, you go anywhere in the world, Singapore, Jakarta, people want to be part of the clean, green economy, and they want to figure out how to make it possible that there are jobs and wealth creation that come with that, and the journey can be made. But I do want to make a couple of observations, sort of pattern recognition of what I've seen so far today. Very much the Alberta spirit. I call all the people who presented today possibilitarians. Everybody sees that we can be architects of our future and not necessarily janitors cleaning up our past. But this comes with a major health warning. The inspiring thing is this is bottom up. But I remember in 2008 living in Toronto after the financial crisis, and the auto sector was on its knees, as we all remember. And the Ontario auto workers, much like the workers' climate plan here, came out and said, hey, retrain us for the green mobility future that's arriving, electric vehicles, hybrids, whatever. Nobody listened to them. Today, as of last week, Tesla is now worth more than Ford. It's now worth more than GM, even though it's only selling 85,000 cars. If they'd listened, where would they be today? When I think of, when we have this conversation about the future of oil and so on, I always get frustrated because historically, oil's got nothing to do, it's a transportation fuel primarily, but it's not a power generating, it's not about power generation. However, and power generation is about electrification and electricity. However, we're seeing the electrification of the auto sector now, rapidly. Tesla, more valuable than Ford or GM. So the message in the bottle here is the future is arriving way faster than we think it is. And not only that, we have other issues like artificial intelligence, where people are worried about jobs and the impact on society. So we have to synchronize two things. One, we have to synchronize the sustainable with the secular. And what I liked about so much of what I heard today was that integration across things. In a way, climate change is not a problem, it's a symptom of a problem, of inclusion, of biodiversity, of so many other things. And so what I'm seeing happening here is that this is forcing or encouraging or provoking Albertans to think about their future writ large as a province and as a society within the context of Canada and the world. And I think that is really, really encouraging. Now, I gave the example of the Ontario auto workers, but there's other possibilities. I was sharing before we came on stage a company in California called Solar Mosaic. When they first started, the person who started it ran the largest climate youth coalition in the US. I met him on a meditation retreat of all things. And I said, one day you're going to start a business. You got so much entrepreneurial energy and I'll back you. Well, a year and a half later, he phoned me up and said, hey, got this cool company, crowdfunding meets community solar projects. And I thought, well, that's really worthy, but you're not going to make a nickel of that. And he said, yeah, but you said you'd back me. So I took my kids' lunch money, repurposed it, and today Solar Mosaic is the largest solar home lender in the US. They lent over $1 billion out now, and they just closed $240 million of private equity funding from a blue chip group in New York, which values them at over $500 million at least. So we have to realize that we have to think outside and forget the box, because the box is no longer helpful. And we have to realize that whatever pace we're going at, we probably got to go faster.
Could you sell cleantech.com to pay for your investment in Solar Mosaic?
I already did.
So for the second part of the panel, Bruce and I are going to go back and forth and pepper the panelists with a few different questions, some related to a lot of the different topics that we've heard here today. And so we're going to, Melina took the middle seat, so we get to pick on her first. And so the thing that really interests me about your background is that you've been involved in a lot of actions and campaigns, some that have been successful, some that haven't been successful. And a lot of the topics that were here today were around the topic of change. So enacting change, bringing change to a community, to a workforce, to an industry, to a system. And so I wanted to have you sort of kick things off and give us your perspective or your thoughts on what have been some of the most effective means of enacting change that you've seen, and any sort of recommendations you have for some of the initiatives brought here today on how they can effectively bring change to their community or their industry.
Yeah, I think some of the campaigns that I've been involved in the past have been, I was actually just telling Andrew, going to Europe to talk to investors about divestment, but also reinvestment. And I think that's something that's really important that we need to see, and I really agree that Solar Mosaic, we need to have that in Canada. And I know the folks from Solar Mosaic, and I think, but not super well, but I think like I want to start that here, you know, because I think in the past, we need to, well, for me, it's saying the yes to the no, because I feel like there's a lot of us in Alberta, maybe not necessarily in this room, maybe some of us in this room, where a lot of us were saying no, like we cannot continue to live this way. This is not sustainable. There's detrimental impacts to the climate, to the water, to the air, to all things, all living things, and we are in a very short time frame right now. And so I felt like, you know, we did a lot of things where telling people, kind of raising the alarm bell, in both here locally and nationally, internationally, but what I am really feel like is the most effective is the yes. What does the yes look like here in Alberta and really across the world? And for me, the yes looks like, at this point, after doing this type of advocacy for over a decade, is the implementation. I feel like that's the most effective. What are actual climate solutions? And I think a lot of us in this room are interested in that. And for me, I feel like that's what's actually effective, is pushing for this type of change. I mean, and I think I'll also be a little bit of a devil's advocate. I think, you know, we do need to see innovation in oil and gas, but we need to see more progressive policy and more progressive innovation of like, how do we actually implement renewable energy systems in Alberta and across the country? Because if we don't do that now, I think, you know, we're kind of trying to fix an old problem right now, and we need to see how we can actually develop a more reliable matrix for the future. So I think I'll just make it really short, because I know we're very limited on time.
Perfect.
Eileen, I'm going to turn to you just for a second, and Andrew referenced it a bit related to that Sunday afternoon in Edmonton, where your boss, amongst other industry icons, were on the stage Just give us a sense of from where you sit and Suncor's view and the climate change and corporate engagement. It's been an evolving piece for your organization. Can you give us a kind of a view from your seat and what you'd like to share with us on that regard?
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, for Suncor, I mean, we have had a climate action plan for, well over a decade. So for us, this has been an evolving journey in terms of, what our ambition is and knowing that we are on a continuous improvement journey. But I would say the first starting place is that, with the challenge of climate change, doing nothing is not an option. And so that's our mantra. You hear Steve Williams say that, our CEO, and that means taking action in terms of our own performance ambition. So we've set a goal to reduce our GHG emissions over the next 15 years, sort of consistent with Canada's 2030 goal and Paris targets. Our goal is to reduce our emissions intensity by 30% by 2030. And we view that as a target on a broader journey to 2050. When I think about 2050 and Canada's ambition and role in the global climate change, I think of my granddaughter. She's 7, and she'll be 40 in 2050. So what kind of a world are we going to leave my granddaughter, Eliza? And that, personally, that's part of what drives me. But I'm really proud to work for a company like Suncor, who is driven by ambition in performance, ambition in leading climate policy, and imperative that we work with others, that we work with civil society. When Steve stood on the stage on November 22nd, and I was in the audience that day, it was with five leaders of some of the most significant environmental NGOs in Canada. And that was because we had been working together over the previous year on what did good climate policy look like. So ambition in performance, ambition in policy leadership, and through all of that, I think that's that collaborative lens that's been really important to us at Suncor. You've seen it in Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. You've seen it at the Energy Futures Lab. We really believe that's an imperative.
Thank you, Arlene.
Shivani, we're going to go to you next. So one of the things that's so interesting about your background is you grew up in Edmonton and you're now working for a renewable energy storage company in Toronto. And so one of the catchphrases that sort of emerged is this idea of the radical middle. And so I have to imagine you have people in and around your life that are on wildly different ends of the spectrum. And so what does that term radical middle mean to you when you hear that as somebody who's entering their career and has a long future ahead of you in this energy transition? What does the radical middle mean to you?
I think part of it is sort of idealistic pragmatism, where there are a lot of perspectives across the spectrum, and it's really just finding the solutions that work. And I like the concept that was talked about today as well of that personal sort of ownership and responsibility. Maybe I'm at the start of my career, but that's not to say this is how the world already is, and I'm not part of the solution. We're all part of the solution. We're all going to make the future happen, and I think everybody in this room recognizes that and is excited about it. And I think in order to make that future happen, you need to engage different perspectives. So I've been an advocate. I've been in finance. I think seeing those different perspectives and finding ways to bring that together is really important. So for Enerstore, we're a project developer of energy storage assets. So it's really about enabling a transition in our generation of energy, and how do we move towards a cleaner, lower carbon energy system. And for each of those projects, how do you make that project happen? How do we take a really cool new technology? We're working with really cool Canadian technology producers of flywheels and compressed air, batteries, all kinds of exciting things that are happening, and that's continually changing. But how do we actually make a project happen? One of the interesting things that's at least in southern Ontario, even with the renewable energy developments, like wind developments, if they haven't been developed properly, if they haven't been developed with the input of the communities around them, there's a lot of pushback against renewable energy developments. People are really not happy with some of the wind developments or big projects in their areas, even if it's clean energy. That doesn't mean that automatically makes it a positive. I think it's really about how do we go about doing it, and how do we engage with the communities? How do we bring in the financing and make sure that it is a solid investment that creates returns? We have a NRSTAR secured funding from a pension fund. And that money is going back to pensioners. How do we make sure that we're creating sustainable solutions that work for everyone? And I think to do that, you need to find that radical middle, I guess, and bring together all of those different perspectives. And I think it can be difficult to do, but I think it can be done. And it just takes people to really say, I'm going to be creative and innovative, and we're going to just make this happen, however, and do what needs to be done to make that happen.
Nick, would appreciate your perspective, going back to the thing we talked about earlier, this whole clean hydrocarbon future. What's your, innovation potential, oil sands, from where you travel, where you were at? What can you share with us, your view related to that future?
So much of the future related to hydrocarbons writ large is going to be dependent on price signals from global markets. It's going to depend on geopolitics. It's going to depend on many things that are really outside of the control of, or imagination perhaps, of those of us here. What I've seen from the outside looking in is several things. First of all, we've seen with water how much better companies like Suncor and others have done on that metric alone. We're now serious about GHGs. With due respect, the price signals were not there to drive innovation until recently, and they're still not there yet. Let's be frank about that. The prices aren't high enough to really drive change, in my view. But we're seeing innovation around collaborative efforts, COSIA, and we've had to go from version 1.0, OSRI I think it was called at one time, and COSIA, and we're learning, because this kind of pre-competitive collaboration is a new thing, and is being trialed here probably more than anywhere else in the world. So I think there's a ton of innovation out there. I don't agree with Bill Gates that we need huge amounts of R&D. I think the solutions are out there. It's a question of getting through the bottlenecks. Like, we don't pay people in the field to take that kind of technological risk. Their job is to get things done on time, on budget. So how do you create a space for innovation to be trialed and then made and kind of investment ready, whether it's the internal capital market in a big company or external investors who go, that makes sense. So I think the challenge, so much of the hydrocarbon industry is that the market hasn't rewarded people for doing the things the right way. And now, increasingly, the capital markets are going to be rewarding people. That said, things like stranded assets and the momentum that's building in the institutional capital world are around concerns that can we burn all the oil in the ground, given the global carbon budget we have. This is an elephant in the room. It's quite concerning. Now, that doesn't mean to me the oil sands industry is ever going to go away, because I think you can repurpose businesses. There's immense capacity, balance sheet, technical know-how, supply chain, marketing know-how, all these sort of things that are inside these big companies that can be repurposed if, as and when, we don't see a viable future in the long term for oil that's in the ground or bitumen that's here. I'm not suggesting that's not the case. I think companies like Imagineer are going to surprise us all about what's possible. And so the knowledge can be repurposed. We're serious about carbon now. I think there's a rebuilding of Alberta's brand that's required after many years of perhaps putting different arguments on the table. At one time, it used to be ethical oil. We don't use that argument anymore because it didn't wash in Europe and elsewhere. So now people can see that we're serious, but there'll be a lag between the intention that's here versus the perception that's out there. So I just want to finish this sort of piece of the conversation by sharing a conversation I had with a cab driver coming from the airport yesterday. So this gentleman was clearly a new Canadian, and I always like to know where people come from, but I don't like to make people feel like they don't belong, so you have to be careful how you ask the question. So I told this particular person I wasn't born here, and he said, oh, that's very interesting. And I then said, have you lived here all your life? And there was a long pause, and I thought, oh dear, I've kind of asked the wrong question. And then he looked at me in the rearview mirror, and he said, no, not yet. And I thought that was just brilliant. And so the message in the bottle here is we're not done yet. We don't know. I think we still have enough control of the puck to determine our future. But to mix my metaphors, particularly at this time in this province, I would ask, where the puck are we going? And that's really the bigger question. Where do we really believe this industry is going? Is it oil? Is it bitumen that we're going to burn? Or is it to be used in other value-added products? And how are we going to get it out of the ground? And I think I have seen an absolute sea change, not just in the Suncors who've led the way, but across the field here. I would say you're ahead of the curve with your competitors in other jurisdictions. And that gives me hope that you've got enough time to make the journey, as your former colleague Gord Lambert would like to call it.
I'm going to press you a little bit more on yours. So I feel like you danced a little bit around the question of the investment side into a clean hydrocarbon play. And so and the general sense I get from your response is that you feel it's not ready yet, that the market isn't there yet on the full production and delivery of clean hydrocarbons or hydrocarbons as an input into plastics or other uses. What would it take for you to make an investment or recommend an investment in a clean hydrocarbon play different from today? So
I'm going to stumble, dance, weave, and go around this because I think that we're coming at this the wrong way. And the last question before we broke was something, low carbon economy. And we've created carbon into a bad thing. Carbon's part of the essence of life. Carbon's not a bad thing. Too much carbon in the wrong place is a problem, just like, too much of anything in the wrong place, including alcohol, is a problem. But carbon can be used in a regenerative way, biofertilizers. You think agriculture, you can use carbon in fixed ways, like Apoorv and the rest of his team are imagining. Pharmaceuticals, I never could even consider that. So if you tie clean hydrocarbons, is it just about the production, or is it about what we do through the full life cycle of carbon? And we can get the economics of oil here competitive with other sources around the world, then perhaps there really is a great future. But those are big ifs, and we have to have the intention, and we have to have the vision. And if we don't know where we're going, we ain't going to get there. So we have to know where we want to go, and build backwards. And I think this is very much what the Energy Futures Lab is all about, is creating that future vision and then working backwards. So I've ducked and weaved, but that's my answer.
Yeah, it was a good answer, but it was a bit of a duck. So Andrew, one of the presentations that sort of struck me earlier in the day that seems fairly relevant to some of your work within the NHL and the Green Program was Jennifer's presentation about trying to have a science-based conversation with a teenager who says this is just the way that it is. And so I'm really curious to get sort of your thoughts on someone who's had success in having conversations about energy, environment, and sustainability in an audience of NHL players that you wouldn't traditionally think of as being ones that would be open to that sort of conversation. And so wanted to sort of set the stage to get your insights on how do you open that conversation with a sports venue or with an agent or with a team or with a player who hasn't talked to David Suzuki or who hasn't done a program at Harvard on corporate sustainability. How do you make that an accessible topic to people who probably have never thought about it before in their life?
In many different ways. I guess it depends who your audience is, but I guess the one thing that goes across audiences is you just have to be authentic. And I think that when we first started looking at doing a carbon neutral program, to explain what it is in talking with David, we said, well, let's just add up all of our travel for the entire year, plane travel, hotel stays, bus travel, and just see what our footprint is for a season of hockey. And so we came up with a number, and one way we said, well, it's a necessary evil. We're going to have road games, so what can we do about it? And one of the things was to buy carbon offsets and support clean energy projects in the developing countries. And so with the help of Suzuki Foundation, we could direct the money to good sources. But so not the easiest to understand, for a lot of guys that aren't interested in it, but. And when we first kind of presented it to the guys, the biggest pushback was, well, I drive a pickup truck though, and I'm not recycling at home, so I don't want to be a hypocrite. And I think that's probably a big hurdle for a lot of people is thinking that in order to care about the environment, you have to do it all, and you have to be perfect. And for us, my message to them was, it's actually better to not be perfect. None of us are. I drove here from Edmonton today. I use a lot of oil, and I love the environment, and I care for the environment a lot. And I think that it's important to make sure that we're not trying to pretend to know it all. We're not trying to pretend that we're perfect. We're all hypocritical in some way or another, and that's all right, And I think that helps bring people's defense down a bit and opens them up to actually have that conversation. And I think embracing those imperfections and while looking for better solutions in your own life or bigger as Albertans, I think that's something that we could do on a personal level, but also as a province. We have to not be so defensive about where we're at or where we've been, and we have to acknowledge the fact that maybe the way that we're getting oil out of the ground isn't the greatest in the world. I think what a lot of people don't realize is I read through all the sustainability reports because I had projects in school, and we looked at different ways of measuring for investors, measuring profitability versus resource use. And so reading through all the different sustainability reports, Shell was actually a very interesting one because Shell was one of the few that had their resource numbers in their sustainability reports, and they had their global emissions and energy use for all their Shell Global, and then they actually had a separate column for their oil sands because it did skew the numbers. They were much more intensive, and so I think it's important for us as Albertans to lower the emotional level down and look at the reality of where we're at, where we've been, where we want to go, and not have to feel like we have to be perfect, but acknowledge that we want to go somewhere, but be able to have the conversation without being intimidated by being pointed as hypocritical or not fully in line, because nobody is. And so I think it's just kind of turning down the emotion on those issues and being able to talk to each other and be real. And that's probably my most effective way. And you can have audience with a lot of different people that way. And like I said, embracing the non-traditional message is I think that's why I love the Iron and Earth guys. I think the moment I probably about a year ago when I first saw their first interviews on TV or in the paper, wherever it was, I was like, these guys are perfect. They're the perfect spokespeople for clean energy and for the transition in Alberta, because it's not about the emotional stuff. It's just about, we want to work. We have skills. We have assets. Let's put them to work. And they're not driving Priuses, all of them, and they're not all wearing Birkenstocks. They just want to work. So
I think I've seen Liam in Birkenstocks.
There's
before,
probably
though,
a couple.
So he may wear
Birkenstocks.
them from time to time.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? I mean, we're Albertans. We all grew up here. We're all very different, but none of us are totally perfect, and nor should we pretend to be.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So as we feared, we were going to run out of time. We've got about 5 minutes left before Chad comes to give us a bit of a wrap. So and Chad started with us this at the opening, this notion of the polarized view. Very briefly, I heard this articulated the best that I can repeat is the Peter Terzakian royalty review. Peter came and gave us a speech after he got the royalty review done, and his task at the time was to take a very diverse community and get to the middle. And he said he always started with breakfast. He fed them first, but they set out on the day to come to a resolution for the matter at hand. And he said we often were very staked out. And the challenge for him as moderator in running this piece was to find a way to the middle, find a way where people were at the end of the day. And I saw Peter often at like 9:30 at night. I remember one night in particular. He just looked absolutely road weary. He was walking back to his office. I'd finished a very nice client dinner and I was heading back to my office, but I had a different step than Peter had. But he said, you know what, Bruce, we finally got there today. He didn't tell me what we were dealing with, but he said we were so far away when we started breakfast, but at the end we got to the middle. So the question for the panel today, just within the time we've got left, is, as Chad talked about, we've got these polarized views that we anchor and hang on to and we're proud of. But as I think some of the panelists have already said, this is where we find ourselves, is where we need to be in the middle, and that's what's going to happen to actually get things through. So maybe just in a wrap-up, if they can share, and starting with Arlene, just maybe a notion of leadership and where we need to find what advice you would have for us, members of the lab, member for the broader community that are here today. What do you think is required of us to get ourselves to finish well and continue to move through this process? And Chad will come and give us a wrap up here in a few minutes. So Arlene.
It's a hard question in just a minute. But I think, as we think about moving to that middle and the solution space, it's about having a positive vision of the future and really being willing to work at that. Like, your story that you told me about, that you just told about Peter Terzakian and being weary by the end of the day, this is really, really tough stuff to stay in the middle. I remember on one of our meetings where we were, sitting around a table with environmentalists and industry, and it was a particularly tough day. And at the end of it, we'd made a lot of progress, and we'd really agreed on, where we were headed to, and we were focused on emissions and reducing emissions and carbon pricing, et cetera. And I said to one of my colleagues, "Are you comfortable?" And he said, "Comfortable? I think I'm going to vomit." It's really challenging, but it's also incredibly worth it. Like, this is where we can make progress on some of the biggest challenges that we face today. And we are blessed. We are blessed with a significant resource and significant talent and strong balance sheets and courageous leaders who have ambition to stay in this space. So,
Thank you. Shivani.
I think it's about adapting, not being afraid to adapt, and not being afraid of change, and thinking long term. I'm reminded of an interesting, I think it's a sort of a profound quote from the Minister of Oil in 1973 in Saudi Arabia. And he said, to get it right, he said, "The Stone Age didn't end for lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before we run out of oil." And I'm not saying that to say that oil is going to end immediately, but I think it's to say that we need to think about the future, we need to think long term. And what is this industry going to be in 50 years or in 100 years? Maybe it will still be around. Maybe we will surprise ourselves and have amazing solutions, and maybe it won't. And I think it's investing today in that future and not being afraid of changing and not being afraid of taking that long-term approach and being creative and thinking outside of the box to find those solutions.
I'm going to quote one of the fellows today. He said, "The validity of the argument is more important than the conclusion, how the conclusion makes us feel." So let me say that again. It was Justin. Do you guys remember this? The validity of the argument is much more important than how the conclusion makes us feel. And I think that's really important moving forward, of how we actually listen to one another and how we actually work with unlikely alliances and how we support each other's initiatives. Because I think there's a lot of we're like, that sounds like a really good idea, but what does that actually mean when we're doing boots on the ground and actually supporting, how does more solar projects going up in communities? I think also too is to close the respecting and knowing our history so we can learn from it, so we can actually truly build a just society that I think all of us want to live in.
I think one of the things that was brought up today is simplicity. So I think I'm going to try to be as simple as possible. And I think that what do we all have in common? We want to put food on the table. We want to have a good job. We want to have a solid province with a strong economy. So that's what we all have in common. So I think to bring us all to the middle, it's figuring out what's going to give us the best chance at that. Is it doing things the way we've always done for the past, however many years? Probably not. The world is changing. It'll be part of it. But we have to come together and say, what's going to put us in the position to give us all what we all have in common, which is that having a strong province with jobs that we can take care of our families. And so I think that let's start from there, and that brings us together. And then we have to have more of an unemotional talk about, what are the best ways to get us there. There's a lot of great ideas out there. But they have to make business sense. And I think that those are the ones that we're going to be looking to our leaders for guidance. But we all want the same thing. We want to live in a strong province in a good position. And I think that most of us could probably agree that we can't just keep doing things the way that we've always done in order to have that in the future.
Right. As the non-Albertan, I have to tell you, I don't really care about 3.5–4 million people. I care about 7 to 8 billion people on a planet. And so why am I here, and why am I so excited? Because what you do here is of global significance. It's almost like Alberta's a petri dish. You've got First Nations who to some degree have been holding the ring for the rest of us while we catch up. You've got this Alberta can-do culture and mentality. You've shown through your political leadership and everything else that you can be inclusive and you welcome one and all. You've got the capital base, both inside companies and in your pension plans and so on. You have everything, and you've got the EFL. You've got everything that is required for the rest of us to make the journey. So we're looking to you to lead, and what happens in Alberta, if you get it right, as you will be of global significance. And that should be enormously inspiring to every one of us.
Yeah. Well, I think I just want to say a huge thank you on behalf of everyone for the panelists joining us today. That was a fantastic discussion, and we just appreciate you guys being here.